Hi, everyone. How are you today? Doing well. So, my name is Mary Grove, and I'm the director of Google for Entrepreneurs, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's talk. Before we get started, just a quick administrative note. We are live streaming and recording this, so if I could ask you to please silence your phones and computers so the pings don't get captured as well, that'd be great. So, it's my pleasure to introduce two of the amazing leaders in our industry who really need no introduction, David Cohen and Brad Feld of Techstars. Techstars has been one of Google for Entrepreneurs' strongest partners for several years now, and we are huge fans and appreciative of all they've done to develop startup ecosystems worldwide. Just a bit of background on David. David is the co-founder and co-CEO of Techstars. He is a serial entrepreneur with two successful exits. He founded Pinpoint Technologies, acquired by Zoll Medical Corporation, and earfeeder.com, a music service that sold to SonicSwap. David is also an active startup advocate, advisor, author, board member. You can read many of his thoughts on these topics at davidgcohen.com. He and Brad also co-authored Do More Faster, Techstars Lessons to Accelerate Your Startup. A bit of background on Brad. Brad is the co-founder of Techstars, an early-stage investor and entrepreneur himself since 1987. Prior to co-founding the Foundry Group, he co-founded Mobius Venture Capital and Intensity Ventures. Brad is active on several boards. He is the chair of the National Center for Women in Information Technology, and he's on the boards of Path Forward, the Kauffman Fellows, and Defy Ventures. Brad is also a prolific speaker and writer. He's written a number of books as part of the Startup Revolution series. You can check out his thoughts and more at the blogs Feld Thoughts and Venture Deals. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming David Cohen and Brad Feld.
Thank you very much.
Lots of familiar faces in the room for you guys.
Yes.
Welcome back to Google.
Feels warm and comfortable.
Absolutely. So lots of topics I'd love to cover today and also take questions from our audience as well. So let's start just with a bit of background. I'd love to hear a bit about the founding story behind Techstars. What was your mission when you started and how has that evolved?
Sure. The whole thing's been an evolution, but the founding story that's kind of fun is I had never met Brad before at that time, but I was reading his blog, like I'm sure a lot of people do still, because it's an amazing resource. Had this idea around Techstars being this mentorship-driven, accelerator process, but really didn't have much beyond that in terms of the network around it. So I went to get a meeting with you, and your assistant said, no problem. Brad does these random days that he'll meet with literally anybody. So I guess I qualified for that.
Great.
And it took me just a short 4 months to get the meeting. The assistant picked a time. It's a 15-minute meeting, I remember, because you were doing them back-to-back all day long. And I walked into that meeting and slid a piece of paper across the table. It's folded in half, and it was basically the idea for Techstars. And I said, I'd love to have you involved in some way. And 10 minutes into the meeting, we were done because Brad had said, I'm in. Love the idea as long as you're not a crook or a flake, because we had just met. So I'm not sure where you are on those topics today.
Still learning.
Yeah, still learning.
What year was this? This was
2006.
Yeah, six, okay. I think. And from there, Brad helped connect a lot of the mentors into that first program that would later become known as an accelerator. That word didn't exist back then, and we apologize for creating the word that got used and overused. And of course, from there, that network built, we built the accelerator programs, and it's really grown from there over 10 years.
I'm interested in the evolution of accelerators generally, and we sort of saw this big proliferation 5 or 6 years ago. We saw a lot of the business models sort of fail around that. What's your current thought on the landscape? What models are working? What have you found that works well in terms of running, scaling, growing accelerators?
Well, I would have a prelude to that and then let you sort of talk about current reality. The evolution of Techstars from where we were in 2007 to where we are in 2018 is important because it's like the evolution of many really successful startups, right? You created it with a premise. I would suggest that most startups have no idea whether the premise is valid or not. Regardless of the enthusiasm of the founders, including us at the time. We also had our view of a downside case. where the downside case was we lose all our money, but we make some friends. Right, so sort of our worst case in running that first program in Boulder in 2007 was that we'd make some new friends with entrepreneurs. The 2007 program was very successful, and we decided to do exactly the same thing in 2008. So rather than go on a journey to start to expand or, turn it into something different, we're like, yeah, we did a bunch of things right, we did a bunch of things wrong, we can improve a lot of stuff. Let's do this experiment again. And we didn't really start expanding Techstars until 2009 when we got pulled by some entrepreneurs to Boston. And that was when we did a second program. So all of a sudden, we've got a program Boulder, program Boston. We then got pulled to Seattle, so we had a third program. We then got pulled to New York, so we had a fourth program. Language is important here. I use the word pull deliberately, was we were having essentially other people who we wanted to participate with pull us to do it, versus us say, we're going to expand into these vectors. The same phenomena happened with our first corporate partners. We had never really thought hard about corporate accelerator or the dynamic of what those relationships might look like. And the very first one was somebody who came to us and said, we want to do what you're doing, but with our ecosystem. Programs like Startup Weekend, which
that's how we met.
That's how we met, and how Google for Entrepreneurs has been an incredible supporter of it for a very long time. Similar kind of phenomena, right? It was something that, the very first program happened in 2007 in Boulder during that first Boulder program because a couple of people said, let's try this, let's see if it works. I have no idea if it's interesting or not, but what the hell? And my role in that first one was that I provided the funding for the food.
It's very important to
and I should
us
say
here
I
at
provided
Google.
half the funding for the food because my partner south of the line provided the other half the funding for the food. But we hung out. You sort of have this thing that unfolds over time and gets pulled in lots of different directions. And I think that's a key operating perspective for not just Techstars, but for many of the companies that go through Techstars or many startups, is that the ones that are really successful get pulled. And as a startup, if you feel like you're pushing into something, looking harder for the place where all of a sudden, I like to say, people won't let you hold on to it. They just want to rip it out of your hands because they want it so badly, whether it's a product or a service or a technology. And as that phenomena starts happening, then layering a strategy of what you're doing on top of that is key, because now you have enough to work with versus sort of the, maybe it's sort of historical business context. Create your framework, figure out your strategy, what's your product going to be, what's the market going to be. And you basically create this hypothesis completely in the absence of any real data. And so our journey really from the beginning to current reality, and I'll sort of hand it to you to talk about current reality and what success looks like, is the dynamics of pull versus the dynamics of push.
It's an excellent observation. And to that point, David, in terms of painting the portrait of current reality, there's so many components to Techstars, from the city programs to the corporate accelerators to the community programs, the venture fund. Can you just give us paint us the map of who is Techstars today? What's your scale and reach?
I'll tie it back to the sort of the other topic. So today, we're 10, 11 years in almost. People know us for the accelerators. There's about 40 of those that we run. So about 400 companies a year being accepted into those in 11 countries, about 40 locations. The tens of thousands of companies that apply there, we're picking from that view, right? So a lot of those are coming through the Startup Weekend activity, which now, having started in Boulder, Colorado the same summer that Techstars started, has grown to be this global phenomenon as well. That's in about 1,000 events a year now in 120 countries, so literally all over the world. And then you also have the venture capital piece, which follows on in our own companies, a sort of capital that's targeted and participating in their success as they grow. So those are the pieces. And when we think about it today, it's very different from how we think about it back then. I think if it were an accelerator in Boulder, Colorado, it wouldn't be a very exciting business. But what it is as a product today is really a network, right? And the way we describe it is it's the worldwide network that helps entrepreneurs succeed. And to do that, we have to be everywhere that entrepreneurs are and want to succeed, and build products along their journey of entrepreneurship from the moment they are inspired all the way through the IPO, right? And so today, a lot of scope and scale. Back then, I think like so many accelerators today on the market, thinking about it as a thing in a place that does 10 companies a year or whatever, it turns out wasn't really a business. The real business is all of that put together. We've seen tremendous growth and sort of the corporate vector that Brad was describing. We're running accelerators now for lots of major corporations, and really getting to work with some amazing entrepreneurs to the point where, today, when you think about the scale of it, about 1 in 20 of the Series A's that happen in the US, the 5 million and up type financings, start with us as the first investor. So it really
pretty
is
remarkable.
It really is something that now has impact across the entrepreneurial ecosystem.
I'd add a couple things into that. Key on the word network that David used, and one of the operating principles from the beginning was this idea of a network model versus any sort of hierarchical model. A book that I wrote in 2012 called Startup Communities talked about this notion of how startup communities evolve as networks versus hierarchies. You can't organize them. There isn't a CEO of a startup community. And for Techstars, we've tried to build this very, very broad network. As part of that phenomena, we've scaled horizontally instead of vertically, right? Which is something that should be near and dear to Google, because I think Google is probably maybe one of the first companies to really start to scale horizontally in terms of technical architecture in a significant way. And if you think about it, instead of having 10 companies go through the Boulder program in 2007 and 50 companies go through the Boulder program in 2018, we have 10 companies go through the Boulder program. And that horizontal scaling, where each program has 10 companies, but now we have 40 companies happening all over the world, generates 400 companies a year that effectively Techstars is investing in through the accelerator program. It allows that network to grow worldwide, and it's built on a principle which I know that Mary shares from all the stuff we've done in the past, which is that entrepreneurship can and should exist everywhere, and that you can build vibrant startup communities and significant companies all over the world. And I think that's been something we've included in our thinking from the very beginning. In 2007, the idea of starting a company in Boulder, Colorado, not that insane, but nobody would look at Boulder and say Boulder is this incredible place to start companies.
People are certainly headed your way these days.
Well, and they, today, Boulder as a data point, if you look at what I think is a really interesting number, which is not the amount of dollars invested in a geography or the amount of companies created in a geography, but if you think about entrepreneurship over a long period of time, it's the number of companies per capita in a geography. And if you actually look at the number of companies per capita in different cities around the world, Boulder's at the top of that list. Not number 2, not number 3, but at the top of the list. It's a relatively small place with this incredible density. But it's not only that. Go back to this network model, right? Google has now a very big presence in Boulder. Just finished a campus there, that can house a couple thousand people. I think it's 1,200 people or so, going to 3,000. And that came from the acquisition of a 40-person company in 2004 called At Last that was based in Boulder.
You may know it as SketchUp.
SketchUp, right? And so the expansion of that and the integration. By the way, Google in Boulder is an extraordinary corporate citizen. Scott Green, we have the sort of local, People of the Year, Entrepreneur of the Year, Business Person of the Year award. He got one of the couple of awards yesterday. And Scott's a good example of that network model, right? And continuing to engage, not just in the context of whatever I'm going to do here is for me as a Google employee, but I'm part of this geography, and so I want to make sure that the activity and vector and interaction around technology, entrepreneurship, innovation is something that's broadly distributed. So I think that's been an operating principle of this as well for us.
Let me build on that. You talked about the density, you talked about the talent pool. Boulder is a great example. So let's zoom out a little bit and talk about your perspective at the ecosystem level. And you have been really investing globally in these communities. Can I ask, what are some of the key ingredients, aside from talent and density, that you think are required for startup communities to really thrive and take off?
So I have a very simple starting point from the book that I wrote in 2012. I'm in the process of writing a sequel to it that'll come out later this year around the notion of how to create a startup community anywhere. And it's been very interesting. A lot of what I've learned over the last 6 or 7 years has also come from the work with Startup Weekend and Up Global and Google for Entrepreneurs. So there's a lot of reflective learning. The core principles are really easy. And they're a little bit counterintuitive to conventional wisdom. Conventional wisdom was that you had to have a really strong research university at the center of it, or else nothing would happen. Another piece of conventional wisdom was that it had to be in a place, excuse me, where there was a lot of sort of top-down economic activity and influence. And it turns out neither of those two things are true. The key principles are, first, that the leaders of the startup community have to be entrepreneurs. So you have to have this motive force of entrepreneurs who are continually investing and building in their startup community. Not government, not university, not big companies, not nonprofits that are organized around it. Those are all support functions. I called them feeders in that book, which is a word I probably wouldn't use again because it was too pejorative relative to how people interpreted it. But this idea that they're different, they play different roles in this. If you don't have entrepreneurs who are playing that leadership role, the startup community won't grow and make progress. The second is that you have to have a very long-term view, at least 20 years. And when people talk about, for example, Silicon Valley and the Bay Area is 110 or 120 years into its entrepreneurial journey. You really have to have this very long-term view of what you're trying to do. And so many organizations, again, university, government, even big companies, run on rhythms that are short-term, right? Quarterly, annually. How much progress did we make this year? What are the metrics that show that our startup community grew? Doesn't matter, right? Play a much longer game. The third is that you have to be inclusive of anyone who wants to engage at any level. And the notion of inclusion and diversity and inclusion in the last, I'd say 24 months has started to become something that is a front of mind conversation. But this idea that anyone, regardless of gender, race, socioeconomic background, educational background, experience, can be and should be able to engage in the startup community is key. And in fact, the more diversity you have going on in that mix, the more vibrant that startup community is. And then the last is that you have to have this super saturation of activities and events going on all the time that engage people around entrepreneurship, not just entrepreneurs. So it's, again, this notion of inclusion around the system of anyone who has any interest in entrepreneurship and innovation. The interesting challenge here, which is really important, is that as entrepreneurial activity increases and as the startup communities become more vibrant, often the signal-to-noise ratio gets really out of whack. A lot of noise, not enough signal. And you see this especially in places like the Bay Area, where there's just an enormous amount of stuff going on. You can't figure out where you should engage, or you can engage in everything and then never get anything done because you're spending all your time running around doing stuff that has nothing to do with making forward progress. And so in the context of the startup community and the maturation of them, making sure that the signal stays high and making sure that the leaders are not necessarily curating what happens, but that everybody can do what they want, but that there's still an engagement model that's such, including by the people who have been engaged and involved in the startup community for a long period of time.
Thank you, Brad. And we can't wait to read more about that in your next book, which comes out when this year?
Later.
Later this year. You heard it
Once
here
you
first.
write it. Yeah.
Later this year.
So David, building upon that, Brad touched briefly upon diversity and inclusion and its importance to Techstars. I know, and today is, of course, International Women's Day. Thanks for spending it with us. Can you talk to us a little bit, David, about the culture of Techstars and how you are addressing building inclusion within your team, part one, and part two, how do you advise, you're working with entrepreneurs who are building companies from the ground up. How do you advise them to think about layering this mentality in from the get-go?
It's funny because we didn't think enough about it, I think, in the beginning of Techstars. There are 4 founders. They all happen to be men. And I think, thinking about it early is the first piece of advice. So we've been building a lot of content and a lot of process and programs to help startups who are at day one sort of to think about this stuff. Because in the end, it's not only the right thing to be thinking about and do, but it's going to make the companies better, which is going to make us better as investors in those companies. So, over the years, certainly worked on ourselves so that when we work on our portfolio, it sort of hits home with them. I think, I don't know, it's 4 years ago now, something like that. We launched something called the Techstars Foundation, which Google's been a huge supporter of. And that is focused on diversity and inclusion in tech. And so we've been experimenting with what's the right model there. We think one of the things we're good at is identifying scalable organizations startups, right, that can go and have impact. If we can do that by finding organizations early on that are going to have this impact long term, then we can support them, and that's useful and helpful. So, we've funded that with a bunch of our own money. Our companies have funded it. We've had incredible support from partners. And today it's a reasonable sized foundation that has made, I don't know, on the order of 10 or so grants, but also has its own programs to try to help have an impact. Very early, one of those was Defy Ventures, which is now something that the whole venture community really understands and talks about. But back then, we were a very early supporter of it. So I think we can play that role in helping identifying something that can have an impact. What Defy does, Brad's now super involved, so maybe you could do their commercial if you'd like. Since you're
It's
so
an amazing
involved.
organization.
Yeah.
It's a lot of fun.
So happy to, and then I'll make another comment, sort of specifically on the gender diversity dynamic. That's something that I've learned from my time at NC WIT, which Google also has been a good long-term support on. Defy provides programs for entrepreneurial programs for people who are incarcerated. And a bunch of Google folks have gone to Defy programs now, a couple, 100, 200, 300. Yeah, so it's become, Rick and I have been friends for a long time. And I think the first program, you went to the one in Lancaster that I went to the first time, right? So we both went for the first time to the same program. And what you do...
So you've been in prison together.
We've been in prison together. The program is called Training EITs, or Entrepreneurs in Training. So, the people who are incarcerated go through a 6-month process that's in prison. It's an educational program. In California, there's quite a wide number of programs. There's a couple of other states where it's pretty prevalent. Now Colorado and Nebraska are two of the ones that are growing very quickly. That 6-month program has a bunch of interim mentoring periods, or sort of business mentoring activity. The curriculum is called Become CEO of Your Life, and the idea is around the notion of second chances. So there's a book that just came out last week called Second Chances by Kat Hoke, who's the CEO of Defy, and it's Kat's story, but Kat's story against the backdrop of her own second chance and against the backdrop of giving people who have been incarcerated second chances. The culmination is graduation day, which is a full day. It was 12 hours for us. We spent at a prison, the first one in Lancaster. That was a level 4 maximum security prison with 50 EITs. There are about 75 volunteers. And it's a combination of a pitch competition, a graduation, and then a bunch of socialization exercises. And for those of us who were the volunteers, you do a day like that in any sort of new context, and maybe you'll have one insight or two insights, and you'll get those insights over and over again throughout the course of the day. So you're like, wow, I never thought of the world that way before. But then that gets repeated. My experience the first time I did this program with Defy was I had 20 different epiphanies over the course of the day. So they just come at you from all kinds of different directions and all kinds of different contexts. And it's a reflective phenomena. So the EITs are having the same experience that you're having in terms of multiple epiphanies from them and how you engage. Here's a great example from a program we just did in Colorado, where our governor, Governor Hickenlooper, came to it. And there's an exercise called Walk the Line, where you get a bunch of questions asked, and if the answer is yes, you go to the line. If the answer is no, you walk back from the line. And the questions become pretty intense, but one of them was, have you ever been in jail? And our governor walks up to the line. And of course, everybody all the EITs are on the line, and they're looking at each other like, our governor? And he admitted it? Right?
What was his story there?
You don't ask the story, right? And by the way, his team, of which it was a half dozen people, they're like, the fuck, our governor just walked up the line, right? So, but you have that moment over and over again. So it's extraordinarily powerful. And if you have any interest in it, it's Defy Ventures is the name of the organization. And I'm Brad at Feld.com, so you can send me a note and I'll get you plugged into it.
But it's creating entrepreneurs where there were none, and the impact of it is, I don't remember the numbers, you may know them, but recidivism, meaning you're going to go back to jail once you're released, that rate is very high normally.
I think it's like 3 or 4% after.
Now, after
right,
Defy,
right.
those people, it's like 3%.
Yeah,
It's
70% in, I think it's in California, maybe US, 70% recidivism within 5 years for people who have had violent crimes. It's under 5% if they've gone through the Defy program, and it's enough numbers now where that's actually a relative
So
statistic.
you're trying to support things like that that are going to have this long-term scalable impact.
Really change, really change how things work. And by the way, doing a pitch competition and the prisons I've been in have been all men with these guys is absolutely fascinating, because like you see these guys who are totally comfortable in certain contexts, just like completely terrified, nervous, uncomfortable, and like having to work through that, and just their own self-esteem that they're working through that in that different context than wherever they landed. The other one I just want to do quickly was National Center for Women in Information Technology, especially in the context of International Women's Day. I've been involved in that organization for over a decade, chair for a number of years. It's about a $10 million a year nonprofit based also in Boulder, but worldwide. And its goal is to help more girls and women get involved in computer science. It started in the mid-2000s, so before people were really focusing on that. It's an organization that's been very inclusive. So instead of it trying to like control the programs, much of the money that we raise, we give to other organizations to fund and help support programs they're doing. As part of that, I learned a very powerful thing that is said some, but I don't think it's being said enough right now around the dynamics of roles men can play in the context of gender diversity. And it's especially true, like, when you have to claim your own identity as a 50-year-old white guy, right? I mean, that's what I am, and that's what I'm going to be.
50.
52.
Oh, you're trying to take a couple years.
50-ish.
Ouch.
I just want to call it out.
Who's
50-ish.
counting?
Yeah.
And
I'm barely in my 40s, so I just wanted to.
the phrase we started using a long time ago at NCWIT NCWIT's a research-based organization, so they've done a ton of research around this. And if you're interested, ncwit.org is the website, and just do a search for male advocate. And the phrase today that's being used is male allies. I think it's a more accessible phrase than male advocate, but the phrase we used for a number of years was male advocate. And this notion of the mistake so many men make around gender diversity is they try to solve the problem. Hi, here I am. I'm now going to solve this problem. And that's completely wrong. The right approach from an advocacy or ally approach is, hi, here I am. I understand and acknowledge that there's a problem. I'm going to participate in helping find a solution to this problem. And this sort of notion of being an advocate or an ally, rather than the one who's trying to control or develop, is so incredibly important. And I think it's one of the reasons why Me Too hit a tipping point, is that Me Too was generated by women basically in Hollywood that amplified this phenomena that had been going on. But it was driven by those women, and the men who have supported it didn't co-opt it, didn't control it, didn't try to change it. And I would just use that as a metaphor that I think is so important around this idea, for me at least, of inclusion. When you're part of essentially a privileged part of the cycle, is to try to be an advocate and an ally rather than the controller or solver, which, again, for a lot of people in position of privilege or position of power is hard. That's a difficult frame of reference to be in, but it's a really important starting point.
I appreciate that so much. I think it's exactly the right way to frame the challenge, the opportunity, and you guys have been at the forefront of leading on many parts. And I think on the Techstars Foundation piece specifically, there are no other organizations I can think of who are investing. It's almost like seed funding for nonprofits, right? Who are working towards diversity and inclusion in tech. And so, I applaud you and thank you for those efforts.
Thanks.
I want to zoom out a bit and talk about policy. You're both active in sort of advocating for entrepreneur-friendly tech policies. What's the current climate around tech policy? What's one sort of anything you're highlighting for your entrepreneurs at the moment and how they can be active advocates?
We're not being sued by the government yet, so that's good.
Speak for yourself.
Unlike this.
No, I'm not right now. Actually, there's an emotional reaction I have to the question, so I'm going to have the emotional reaction first. Government, especially federal government, makes me very tired. And it's an emotional, that's my emotional reaction. It makes me very tired, not because I'm cynical, angry, unhappy, whatever. It's just slow. And that's actually by design in the US, right? Like our democracy, one of the operating principles of it is it's hard to change things. Lots of things change, right? But it's hard to change the long arc over time, for good or for bad, right? Both sides of that. So it's a thing that I've learned by being involved on a couple of vectors. For me personally, the two things that I've cared the most about as it applies to tech are immigration reform and patent reform. On immigration reform front, personally, I believe that a human being should be able to start a business wherever in the world they want, and a human being should be able to go anywhere they want in the world and work for where they want to work. Like that mobility in the U.S., the sort of mobility across state borders is something that's made our country incredibly powerful. The ability to have people who for many, many years, everybody wanted to come to the U.S. to start their business. And the U.S. was, the innovation engine of the U.S. was so enhanced by that. Like the idea that there's any meaningful friction for somebody who wants to come to the U.S. to be able to, number one, come to the U.S., number two, start a business in the U.S. Is ludicrous to me. If you wind the clock back to even 2009, 2010, if you're an entrepreneur in another country and you want to come to the U.S., you have to navigate this Byzantine system to get the appropriate visa to be able to start your company in the US. And there's very few ways to do that. It's very difficult. And so there was a group of us in 2009 or 10 that started something called the Startup Visa Movement to try to get a visa that allowed entrepreneurs to come to the US to do it. And one of the things that stimulated that for me personally was two Techstars companies that had non-US founders in our second program. Two of them were from Canada, really, really scary country. Lots of dangerous people.
I'd build a wall if I were them.
Yeah, if you were them, right? Yeah, One Direction. And then the other founders were from Europe. The one I remember was from France. I think one was from England. And they, after Techstars was over, they wanted to stay in Boulder, and they couldn't get visas to stay and had to go back to Canada and Europe to run their companies. And I thought that was insane. So I've put a lot of energy personally, and I'd say sort of around the system within Techstars, we've gotten reasonably good at helping founders that are non-US founders be able to figure out how to stay in the US after they've gone through the program. But we've also expanded geographically very aggressively to make sure there's lots of places around the world where we can engage. From a policy perspective, I think this is the biggest industry policy issue that has to do with long-term US competitiveness. Because I think what's happening on a very systematic basis, you've already seen these massive shifts of movement of capital to other parts of the world. And yes, the amount of capital that's being deployed against startups and technology companies is growing very rapidly, but that ratio is changing equally rapidly away from the US. And there are many, many entrepreneurs that I know internationally who don't aspire to come to the US to start their companies anymore. And I think that's a tough one. The other one that I care about, which is patents, I would say personally, I'm kind of at the patent system is so tangled up in itself that it'll just sort of work itself over time. There are then second order issues which are happening, right? I mean, Google, I know, is in the midst of sort of all the dynamics around the election and news curation. You have this whole phenomena around cryptocurrency and how to think about cryptocurrency. Many of these things are, from my frame of reference around innovation, areas where entrepreneurs should be respectful of the current context that they're operating in. Like our advice is be respectful of the context, but at the same time, don't be unwilling to challenge whatever that context is. I think a mistake that plays out over and over again is entrepreneurs ignore the context completely, pretend like the context either doesn't exist or is irrelevant, and then downstream, you might end up being very successful as a business, but you create an enormous dislocation and second order effects by not being respectful of that context going in.
Thank you, Brad. Thank you. I'm avid readers of both of your blogs, and David, interesting post you made about a comment about making sure to have a pessimist in the room. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Sure.
I think I consider you an optimist.
You have to be an entrepreneur, right? But it's also important to surround yourself with at least one person in a decision-making context that's not necessarily one of these pessimists that's like, that'll never work, but more look, I'm really worried about this or that. And I think too many entrepreneurs surround themselves with people that are like themselves not enough diversity in the room, of diversity of thought in this case, to where if you don't have that, you end up just going down the wrong path, and it can be this asymmetric risk where that thing didn't work out and it ends up blowing up everything, and the stakes get high as these companies grow. And I just had a couple recent examples of witnessing that, and just a little reminder to have somebody in the room that's very smart, very respected, that isn't necessarily just an optimist, right? That says, well, maybe this could go wrong, and let's at least think about what could happen. I've seen it save companies, so that's why I wanted to write about it.
That's great.
I'd add one just quick thing.
Sure.
It's important on the dimension of diversity is that there is a whole language around culture, and you want to add people to your company that fit your culture, and I think that's nonsensical. If you are simply adding people that fit your culture, especially as a startup, what you're doing is you're homogenizing your thinking, and you're actually going to sort of recede to the norm in terms of your thinking. You're not going to have people challenging what's going on. You might have different frames of reference on specific things, but you're not going to get a broader view. The phrase we like to use is culture add. So instead of getting people into your company that fit your culture, everybody that joins your company adds to your culture. And instead of using the word culture, I personally like to use the phrase cultural norms, because there's a difference between culture and cultural norms. And your cultural norms are, your stated value system, the way you're going to behave, that sort of thing. And so if you're continually adding to your cultural norms, that's a pretty dynamic thing. And that'll cause you to be more inclusive of other frames of reference, which will also include having people who will tell you that, I don't agree with that idea, versus, a very consistent, homogenized group, which when you're 3 or 4 people may or may not matter, but when you're 20 or 30 people, has a big influence on what goes from 30 people to 100 people in a successful case.
And on cultural add, I first heard that from Mitch and Frida Kapor, right? Talk about that a lot, and I think we've really tried to adopt that and help companies try to think about things that way. That's just a great way to think about it differently.
Great framework,
right?
Cultural add. So in a few minutes, I'm going to switch over and take questions from our audience if you want to start thinking of those and teeing those up. But just a couple quick fun ones while I have you. I want to get some life hacks here. So tell us, when you're not writing books, what book are you reading right now?
I am a fairly promiscuous reader. I read about 100 books a year, and I read lots of different stuff. My favorite books to read are science fiction. So I try to, every 3 or 4 books, read a random science fiction book. In terms of recent book that I read that was really thought-provoking was a book from an MIT series of sort of shortish books, 100, 150-page books, called Post-Truth. And it's a series of books around specific topics, right? So they have a book on robotics and a book on artificial intelligence that somebody wrote. It's sort of a primer. And this one was on this idea of post-truth and how postmodernism and postmodernist thought plays into the way today we talk about what is truth or what is fake news or what is not truth. And yeah, that was an interesting one if you're had a lot of bias in it too, by the way. So you had to sort of read through the bias, although the author exposed his bias at the beginning, right? So you're like, this is his bias. Okay, I got his bias. Oops, I bumped into his bias again. Like that was a good book. One other book, if you're interested at all in history or interested in whatever's happening currently, is a book by Will and Ariel Durant. It's about 150 pages. They're the ones that wrote like the 12-volume, 10,000-page books about the history of society. It's called Lessons of History. And it's basically 10 short chapters on different topics, right? Government, education, religion, morality. And they used all of human history to show that it's the same shit over and over again. And in very, very sort of short bite-sized chunks. And it was actually for someone who has moments of, regular moments of anxiety around, whatever's happening, it's very reassuring to read something like that and realize that over the course of human history, yes, we've made progress on a bunch of dimensions, but yeah, a lot of this shit's the same.
And we survive.
And we survive.
David, three apps you can't live without.
Oh, I was going to give you the book one.
Oh, give me the book one first.
I'll just give you the titles because they're so great.
Okay.
So the one that our whole team is reading right now, which we do as a team sport, I have no idea how you read 100 books a year.
No kids.
I guess that must be it.
I don't
Three
need
kids.
an electronic car.
That's probably it. 3 kids. How We Decide, which is emotional decision making, which is an older book, but it's super impactful if you haven't read it. And then the one that really changed me recently is called The Soul of Money. It's sort of you are what you spend and how you can use money to have impact. So really interesting. 3 apps. I'll give you one, and I'll try to think of others while I give you one. Gmail, yeah, you should use that. One that I use that actually people don't know much about is called Voxer. It's a voice message back and forth really quick. So we're 200 people all around the world, small company, but very distributed. Biggest office is maybe like 20 of us. So it's a way to have hallway conversations. Brad's going to demonstrate, apparently. Just like on WhatsApp, that has that tiny little button that no one pushes for the voice. Voxer's got a big button, and that's why I like it.
So you guys use this within Techstars?
We literally run the company on it. Yep.
Hey, David, you having fun with this Google thing right now?
Yes.
I'm in the middle of a great
talk. If Voxer
talk.
is listening, they can totally tune into the strategy of Techstars just by, stealing our data and listening. So that's a big one that I think helps us a ton, because you can't, when you're so distributed, you can't have that sort of meaningful conversation in the hallway. So it lets us do that, and I love it.
My last question for you, I'm just so curious, how you manage your time, scale yourself. We're always looking for life hacks. You talked earlier about when you first met that Brad had a couple days set aside for meetings with anyone in 15-minute intervals. Do you have any hacks, tips for people who are juggling, a million things? How do you prioritize and run your life?
Guess what? Brad wrote a book. He's a book salesman.
I am.
I could be on this topic.
Yeah, I wrote a book with my wife.
You have a book on every topic.
Not quite. I have a book I wrote with my wife, Amy Batchelor, called Startup Life. Surviving and Thriving in a Relationship with an Entrepreneur is the subtitle. So if that sings to you, it's available at all booksellers named Amazon, and others as well. For me, the biggest, and there's a bunch of hacks in that book, by the way. Amy and I do a thing called 4 Minutes in the Morning, where each morning we spend like 4 minutes together, sort of first thing, just getting set. We don't have kids, but we play with our dogs and we talk, and sometimes we have a cup of coffee together, but it's linked to whoever wakes up last. So whoever wakes up last, that's a prompt for the person who woke up first to stop whatever they're doing and just spend a few minutes together as a way of grounding ourselves in a relationship.
You can also do it in 3 minutes to save time. Not use 4. It's another hack.
The most profound thing that I've incorporated into my life in the last couple of years around this is I used to be that person who woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning every morning, no matter what time zone I was in. I worked all the time, the 24/7 thing, and I had ego attachment to the fact that I was always getting up at 5 o'clock, even if I flew cross country and needed to sleep for another couple hours. And I was always available. I'm try to be very responsive to email, try to sort of always engage. And I'm Jewish but not religious, and I got very depressed at the end of 2012 for about a 6-month depressive episode in 2013. And some of that was just, there are a bunch of things that played into it, and I'll leave that riff for another day. But 2 things that I did that were really powerful life hacks is I stopped waking up with an alarm clock. And what happened was I slept 12 hours or more a day every day for the next 6 months. So I did not realize how physiologically exhausted I was. And I love sleep. And so I'm really now very focused on making sure that on a regular basis I'm getting at least 8 hours of sleep a night. So sort of valuing sleep, especially as you start to get a little bit older. There's a good book about this that relatively recently came out. But there's just so much evidence now that sleep is a critically important thing around both physical health, mental health, and productivity, like your ability to concentrate for extended periods of time. The other thing that was profound for me on this dimension is, and it ties back into the Jewish thing, is that I started having a digital Sabbath. So from Friday night sundown to Saturday night sundown, no email, no phone calls, no meetings. I just have time for me, for Amy, for my dogs, for friends, for reading, for what, that's how I read so
No
much.
kids.
No kids, but if I had kids, I would play with my kids. Like or I'd give them to somebody else so I'd have some free time. Actually, I'd probably sell them if I
I'll
had
bring
kids.
my kids over. You
No,
can go.
please don't do that. But that one day a week of complete disconnect from the digital world that we're in I don't watch television, right? Just disconnect. And I have time for myself. The first 4 or 5 months of doing that each weekend is excruciating, right? Like, oh my God, I might miss an email. It's only 9:15. I've got a full fucking day still to not check my email. But after a while, you really get into this place where it creates this enormous amount of space. And when you sort of re-engage with the world, and I often stretch it to Sunday morning, I kind of re-engage with the world Sunday morning, what you start realizing is you didn't miss much, right? And every now and then there might be something that might have been additive if you had some involvement. And there's occasionally things that I have project stuff that I have to do on Saturday. But the point I would make of this life hack is making sure you're giving yourself real time each week for you, however you do it. And I saw a phrase in a book somebody else wrote that I'm proofreading for him or giving a pre-read for. That's he shifted from 24/7 to 24/6. And I love that idea. And I don't care whether you distribute the 24 hours across the week or I think it's easier to distribute across a day, but to disconnect from all the nonsense that we're dealing with all the time and all the stimuli so that we can remember that we're human and we can spend time with the people we want to spend time with, especially ourselves, and allow you to then have the energy to go after the next 6 days of whatever that intensity is. It's been a big one.
So your message to Google employees: work less. That's
Work less, sleep more.
That's what you're trying to
As
say.
a mom
less
of
in a
one-year-old
nutshell,
twins, Brad, your
take
comment
time off
about
and
sleep
just
is making me
relax.
very, very nervous. David, any quick hacks to add?
One hack is if you're going to write a bunch of books, you should totally outsource the chapters of those books to others, like Brad did with the Startup Life book and Startup Relationship.
Yeah, all my books. Startup Life.
Yeah.
If you read any of my books,
Do More Faster, we did the same.
There's a bunch of sidebars in them. And basically a typical hardback book is about 50,000 words. And I figured out that you can get other people to write about 20,000 of the 50,000 words.
So you got me to write the chapter in that book,
Yeah.
which was always have a light at the end of the tunnel. We get in these periods of time where we work really hard, and I found in my family just knowing there's always a thing coming up that's really exciting, a trip or time off or whatever it is. Just don't ever not have one of those, no matter how far out it is, and it helps everybody stay sane in the context of these busy periods that we all go through.
Great advice. Thank you. Any live questions from our Googlers? Yes.
I have a microphone here. People have questions.
Thank you, guys. It was fantastic to have you here. I find myself thinking a lot about something you said at the beginning, Brad. In all the new projects that I start, I find myself pushing and pushing and pushing. And then you were talking about the dynamic of pulling. How do you think about that? Is it an indicator that this is a normal thing? Do you have to push at the beginning, or maybe my ideas are not so great?
Well, I actually think most ideas at the beginning are totally irrelevant, right? And they're just way overrated, right? You start with an idea, and my partners and I joke about this. I have, 100 shitty ideas for every good idea that I have, and the thing that works, it's magic, is I let the 100 shitty ideas out, right? I don't hold them, or I don't grab the first one and then anchor on it and try to turn it into a good idea. Now, in the context of a project, you could say, well, but this is a project I'm going to be working on for 6 months. Like, that's the thing. And what I would say is break it down. Like, engineering problem, make it reductionist into lots of little ideas and run lots of little experiments, knowing that most of the experiments are going to fail, or most of your hypotheses are wrong early on. And you're running a bunch of them because you're looking for one to grab hold. Now, the mistake would also be, or another mistake would be, to assume that pull is something that happens programmatically. Yeah, you have to go out there and hustle. You have to talk to people. You have to experiment. You have to try to convince people that this is interesting for them to even try it. And if you do that, and time after time, quickly, it's all not interesting, and you're not getting any feedback back, that's a problem. If you're getting feedback back, then you're constantly adjusting, right? And so you're playing that 100 ideas until you get the thing that you land on where all of a sudden people are pulling. So at the very beginning, no, you're not going to have something spring fully formed out of your mind that everybody's going to get excited about. And if they don't, you should walk away from it. But try to keep breaking down into smaller and smaller chunks the experiments that are causing you to learn and modify the fundamental premise of your idea until all of a sudden you find people trying to rip it out of your hands.
Thanks for being here, guys. I was a former Techstars participant, so thank you for organizing that. I guess question at top of mind: what does success look for you guys for Techstars in like 10 years? Where do you want to see yourselves, and what impact do you want to have on the world?
Yeah. So when we think about building this big network, it's really helping more entrepreneurs succeed. So figuring out more ways to do that. Certainly, it's more worldwide. We want to be investing in many more places. Today, 400 companies a year. We want to really see that scale. And I think we need to help them in more parts of the entrepreneurial journey. So today we have products that are very helpful in the very early stages. We get a little bit helpful as they sort of grow, and then eventually we hope maybe someone else comes along and is great and helps that company succeed. And connecting them to those people is part of what we do. But I think we can play more of a role in showing the world that there are going to be more great startup communities, that great companies are going to be built everywhere, and that there's a role perhaps we can play throughout that entire journey and not just at the beginning of it.
We have time for one final question in the back.
Hi. So, Techstars obviously has a huge mentor and volunteer network and so on. And if you had to give advice to someone who wants to sort of build the necessary skills to get into that space, what would you say that they start off with?
When you say that space, you mean?
Just like in the accelerator space as a mentor, as a volunteer and so on. So what kind of skills would you say that they should start off with or start building on?
To become a mentor and help other entrepreneurs, yeah. So there's a post that I guess I curated on my blog. A lot of people contributed to called the Mentor Manifesto. Okay. That we try to sort of list, what is it that you should be doing as a mentor? And I think one of the things that people think about when they hear that word is that this is somehow you've been a person that's built a billion-dollar company and you had this amazing outcome. And my argument is now everybody's a mentor. Every single person in this room, there's someone who knows a lot more about something than I would know about that thing. So everybody has something to contribute, some expertise, some advice that they're speaking from experience on. I think that's the key to being a good mentor, is recognizing where do my experiences lie, what areas can I be helpful in. And it's okay that I don't know everything, right? I can come and be helpful in a context, in a situation. But the Mentor Manifesto does a pretty good job of laying out sort of what I think of as the social norms for sort of being a mentor. Don't come in and try to answer all the questions. Try to stay in the areas you understand. Listen, right, as much as you talk, right? And there's a whole list of things that you can read about in that post. But I think everybody can contribute to the success of others in that way.
One thing to add to that is practical things you can do is engage, right? And do things with other people who are interested in entrepreneurship. Startup Weekend is a great example of it. Go do stuff, right? Like reading, watching videos, talking to people, sort of trying to learn on a receiving side is so different than actively practicing the activity of entrepreneurship, especially if your mentor engagement is not necessarily as an entrepreneur, but as a domain expert in some area where you can help other entrepreneurs because of your domain expertise. Understanding how entrepreneurs think, work, what it feels like by doing is so much more visceral than observing or studying it.
Got it. Thank you.
David, Brad, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for all that you do for the ecosystem. I see, Don Loeb, John Beadle from Techstars here. Thank you to the whole team, and thanks for being a great Google partner.
Thank you, Mary.
Thanks for having us.